Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I hope I hope the life that you find yourself living is, how shall we say it? That as you come to terms with it, you're finding that there are no terms that quite can say it, such that you keep thinking to yourself, I wish there should be a word for that. And that those words that you make up in describing your life are ones in which you would want to use ongoingly. So I hope you're doing well. I wanted to read over this paper that I have been writing, which is going to be a chapter into it in an anthology with Chris and John Vervaeke and I think Jordan Hall and a lot of the people that I've been talking to on my channel. And the book is going to be called Inner and Outer Dialogos. And so I've been working on this for the last number of months, as you probably heard me talk about. And it's interesting because I've never really written anything kind of academic, or at least academic like this. So this is my first venture into doing so. And I'm finding it to be incredibly immersive in a really cool way. And having something that, because I'm always thinking about stuff, right? I'm always wondering about things and contemplating things and meditating on things and, cultivate as much as I can or find myself in a state of wonder about what's happening and what is reality and what is being. It just seems to me that whatever that wonder bug is, its valve is really open. And there's something about having this writing project has been a very close feedback loop for that. So it's I have this experience of almost like everything I'm doing is running through the frame of this paper. So I'm just about done with it. But I wanted just to read through it, just to see how it all comes together and notice places that aren't quite fluent or that I want to change or as I'm reading it. So thank you for tuning in. And this is just the rough draft of the paper. And what I'll do is I'll just read through it, and I'll probably stop at certain points and extrapolate and maybe do it a little bit like you see in these kind of academic conferences where they, somebody gives a talk and then they read and then they talk about what they just read and then they go on reading, something like that. So, okay. So I'm going to read it here from my computer. And here's the introductory part. In this chapter, I attempt to look through the logos, and not just hear logos, but rather, following Heraclitus, listen to logos. Through listening, show logos as precisely what is nearest and at the same time, and by virtue of its nearness, is simultaneously the most remote and hidden from us. It is precisely the history of this deafening to logos that characterizes the nihilism of our modern epoch, in which Heidegger calls the age of technology. Following Heidegger's reading of Holdren's poem, quote, "Where the greatest danger, so too is the saving power," unquote. I will propose precisely the moment we hear that we are not listening is the same moment listening to logos has begun. In other words, through looking at the emergence in the culture of what John Vervaeke has termed psychotechnologies, and hearing what these practices are responding to can be a way of hearing the gathering of the logos from out of its own concealment and perhaps giving us a hint in how to listen, and in so doing, attune to Logos' discontingent, sustaining source. It is in this spirit that I will look to the social, relational practice of circling, that since its spontaneous emergence in 1998 has organically spread throughout the world to be a revelation of and a response to the loss of Logos. Specifically, the loss as the missing sense of meaningful interpersonal connection and community rapidly disappearing in our time. I will attempt to show through an in-depth examination of the way circling is practiced to be a disclosure of the Logos through enacting philia, making way for philia Sophia and the possibility of dialogos. So if you're not familiar, philia is it's considered, the most simple translation is it's the love of friendship, right? And in the deepest sense, in the way that I'm meaning, it's the friendship that it's the I-thou love, the way of being it's a love that's not a possession, but a friend in the deepest sense of the word, that there's a sense in which you find yourself just wanting them to exist for its own sake. So, philia. I go on. I will first lay the groundwork by inquiring into the meaning of the word logos through examining the etymology of key terms, harkening back to Heraclitus and ancient Greece. This will show the primacy of logos as the dynamic ground of intelligibility, enabling access to the world as such. This will allow us to appreciate the profundity and implications of the loss of logos, making way for understanding of Heidegger's notion of the history of being. Through sketching out Heidegger's astonishing insight into the history of metaphysics as the forgetfulness of being and the basis of nihilism and the technological instrumentalizing dominance of our current epoch. This will lay the ground to zero in on a specific structural change technology has made on the medium of social discourse. Here, I will look at social discourse as a mode of logos. This will reveal sociality in a profoundly different light than traditionally understood by the social sciences. Rather than sociality being a region of our world as a result of our social activity, instead, when understood as logos, the world is precisely what enables our social relations. The speech of social discourse becomes the way the logos weaves the intelligibility of the world as such. Understanding the social as an ontological dimension of being as such lets us see what has always been at stake in our social relations is the world itself. This understanding allows us to attune to the historical unfolding of the world and hear the logos speak from out of its anonymity, addressing our conscience as a call to authentically being with. This will also allow us to appreciate the depth of what is at stake in dialogue as a site for world closure and disclosure. With this context, we examine the emergence of circling in full breath of the Logos, and the possibility it opens to hear the original voice of Heraclitus from the future as the possibility of Theologos. Okay, so that's the introduction. Okay, the first section here is called Logos and Meaning. Right. To the degree the world and my to the degree the world and my life is felt as intrinsically meaningful is to the degree to which the particular situation of my being in the world is sensed to be connected to what is greater and beyond me. The particular people, places, and events in my life glow with a sense of moreness, calling me beyond the current shape, my current shape, thereby shaping the world that shapes me, weaving the articulation of a togetherness already whole. Conversely, when my being in the world loses its intrinsic sense of meaningfulness, the particular such situation of my life becomes what I am standing over and against, having to deal with it. The dealing of which is contingent upon my effort of production, of producing an outcome, which is the next contingency I stand over and against. This process as such itself already, always being the outcome itself contingent on the previous generation of production. The world becomes the standing means reserved for extraction and optimization of further production. Martin Heidegger, in his thinking, The Metaphysics of the West, saw, I should turn that off, sorry about that, do not disturb. Okay, sorry about technical difficulties. Martin Heidegger, in his thinking, The Metaphysics of the West, saw the nihilism it necessitated as the, quote, forgetfulness of the being of beings, unquote. In other words, when the non-contingent wholeness of being is not heard, beings do not disclose the sense of moreness, but rather derive their meaning in terms of their utility, function, and contingency. Logos gathers what all beings have in common and in their togetherness as beings. In other words, the gathering of being into beings is the Logos. My aim in discussing the Logos is less explanatory as initiatory. Initiating in the same way the Logos, through Heraclitus, initiated the origin of the Western thinking of being, and thus the originating source of all thinking since. By source, I do not mean something that is earlier than everything else, but rather, by source, I'm going to say that again. By source, I do not mean something that is earlier than everything else, but rather comes as the earliness itself. The Logos, as originally spoken by Heraclitus, is the non-contingent sustaining principle and source, gathering the togetherness of the unity of being into intelligibility. Logos is the ontological gathering, the self-arising thatness, phusis. That's an ancient Greek word, phusis, which basically means the gathering, the self-arising thatness, and the whatness, ousia, of being as such, that presupposes and sustains a unity, enabling them to be grasped as being. Historically, the logos has meant word, speech, reason, order, gathering, logic, order, and even divine word and divine reason. What these words have in common is they all speak of intelligibility. They are words that express the principle at work when something is intelligible and thus understandable. Webster defines intelligible as capable of being understood or comprehended. The word's etymology comes from the inter, meaning between, plus legere, which means choose, pick out, read. And the root of that is leg or liege, which means to gather, to collect, and to gather. In other words, something is intelligible by virtue of it gathering into standing out, able to be understood or grasped, legere, from within, inter, itself as itself. What is the itself that gathers into itself, making it intelligible? In other words, what accounts for the intelligibility of intelligibility? This is spoken in the root it has in common with logos, leg or liege. I don't know which one it is, liege or leg. The original gathering that gathers something to stand out from itself as itself is logos. Logos is the way the world gathers into manifestation. Yet, logos is itself not a thing that appears. Rather, logos is the way the whole of being speaks through the particular situation of beings. Logos withdrawals in letting the world appear, resonating with the sense of the inexhaustible as such. This paradox of logos's disclosure via its concealment as being is perhaps what accounts, oh, wait a minute, let me read that over again. The paradox of logos's disclosure via its concealment as beings is perhaps what accounts being viewed holistically as the mysterious and enigmatic. It is also what makes it possible to become deaf to logos. So in other words, I have to rewrite that paragraph. But basically, what I'm trying to get at there is there's a way in which, on one level, logos allows things to appear as the things that they are, right? It allows me and the light and ideas and thought and everything that's intelligible to reveal themselves and stand out as understandable and intelligible. Yet, logos itself never appears as a thing, right? So I'm trying to get at that. So there's a way in which it's very openness. It's the way that it reveals, on some sense, all that is, right? Is also the way it conceals itself. And so that may account for its enigma, right? And how we can possibly not hear it. And I can write a paragraph that doesn't make any sense about it. Okay, so this is, I go into a fragment by Heraclitus. This is fragment 50. And the translation that I use here is, quote, "Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourself," parentheses, psyche, gather yourself, psyche, into the gathering itself, logos. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all, unquote. To my understanding, What this fragment speaks to is the key to understanding the Heideggerian sense of being, and specifically how being can be listened to as a way we live in and participate in being's non-contingent disclosure. It can also show how we can become forgetful of being, and thus beings are revealed in only their contingency and utility. Listening to the Logos, Heraclitus says, is not listening to me. This discloses that it is possible to hear the Logos without listening to it. This, I propose, sheds light on nihilism as the forgetfulness of being, as well as revealing an insight into the Logos's role in addressing it. When we only hear the speaker, but not the Logos, is an analogy to only hearing beings and not the being of beings. So there's this parallel where, to explain this a little bit. So Heidegger's, if you're familiar with Heidegger, he's constantly, talking about this ontological difference that this Western sense, right? And this really only came about, and I think Heraclitus and the pre-Socratics were the first ones to conceptualize this. It was like a big bang of intelligibility that defines everything that we call anything at all from our perspective, right? We're living in what opened up, which is the sense in which the being of all beings, that which all beings are grounded in and arise out of and fall back into, right? Being, you could say, with a big B, that ontological difference. So that's what I'm referring to and trying to get at with this, is that the Logos is the one that kind of gathers that, you could say, gathers the intelligibility of the being of beings, right? And without Logos, right, things are still intelligible, right? They're still, you can still understand them, you can still make sense of them, but they don't reveal the sense of moreness, their weirdness, their luminosity, right? That can shine through them when being as such is disclosed. And that listening to Logos I believe, is the key to that shining forth, right? Okay, so I'm gonna read on. This fragment reveals its depth only if we understand the Logos is not simply already, quote, in the one. If this were the case, the all would already be atoned to the one, and we could simply passively hear it. Instead, it takes a, quote, fitting knowledge. What is this fitting knowledge? Fittedness refers to continuity of belonging together. In what way does the human being belong together with Logos? To the ancient Greeks, and explicitly articulated by Aristotle, what makes the human being distinct from all other beings is its Logos. More specifically, the human being lives in speech in every way. Speech being another word for Logos. The human being is born into a world structured by language, and thus becomes the being they are in and through speech. As Heidegger says in a lecture course on Aristotle, he puts it, quote, here's the quote, speech is the being and becoming of humans themselves, unquote. Speech is the being and becoming of humans themselves. So you can see this very, very tight relationship. And I go on. In other words, human beings are the beings they are in their fundamental constitutional openness to Logos. Fitting knowledge, therefore, is synonymous with the human beings coming to full realization their possibility of being. Therefore, listening to the Logos, as Heraclitus' suggestion, is the same process for our human being in the world to realize the world through being with others in full authenticity as the one atoning all. It's kind of a complex paragraph. I'll read it again. Fitting knowledge is synonymous with the human beings coming to full realization, coming to fully realize their possibility of being. Therefore, listening to the Logos, as Heraclitus is suggesting, is the same process for our human being in the world to realize the world through being with others in full authenticity as the one atoning all. So in other words, what I'm saying is that in order to hear the Logos, right, to gather yourself into the gathering itself in as the one atones all, right, this revelation of the moreness in the suchness of the particular, that the Logos can gather us, that are listening to that, given that we are a being that has Logos, right, that realization is also, you can't separate it from the realization of the human being as such. So the realization of being and the realization in what it takes to realize being is exactly what it takes to realize ourselves, right, in our potentiality for being as such, okay? Yet, implied in our gathering, I'm going on here, yet implied in our gathering into the gathering itself is that it is not simply given. It is given as an ontological potential of being. However, if not taken up with authentic participation, one is destined to fall into mere hearing. Authentic listening is something one undergoes with one's whole being as a realization of our openness as an enacted unity with the Logos, which actualizes the one atoning all. Or, as Heidegger may say, the disclosure of the being of beings is the clearing of Dasein's authentic potentiality for being. And just a note, Dasein is Heidegger's word basically for the being of human beings. Heraclitus is also giving us a hint to what happens when we do not listen and merely hear. Just hearing the speaker is synonymous with inauthentic being in the world, where the one does not atone all. This is the world of what Heidegger would call average everydayness, as inauthentic being in the world. This is a mere hearing, only the surface of appearances, as the way things are, quote unquote, and living unquestionably in the given world you already always find yourself in. You're still living in speech, Logos, however, in an unminding way, where you simply do what one does because this is what one has always done. In some sense, you live within the measure of the Logos, yet being profoundly asleep to the uncanny fact that you really exist and you really are going to die. You respond to the all of beings. However, the contingent source of being's intelligibility goes unrecognized by you, and thus the one isn't even missed and not taken into your concern with the all as such. As Heidegger points out, inauthentic being in the world is simply part of human life and was so for the ancient Greeks. However, the history of the understanding of being moved out of the Greeks into modernity in terms of metaphysics, has made human life increasingly less likely for authentic hearing the sound of logos, which we will explore more later in this chapter. Yet, the conditions for the possibility that such a listening to logos is also the very same conditions that make logos likely not heard. Here's that paradox again, right? Again, Heraclitus gives us a hint. Here's fragment 54. And here's the fragment. A harmony that refrains from appearing is more vigorous than one that strives to and attains an appearance. So I'll read that again. Fragment 54, Heraclitus. A harmony that refrains from appearing is more vigorous than one that strives to and attains an appearance. The logos in this non-appearing harmony attests to the original Greek sense of truth as aletheia, as the happening of or unconcealment, or as Ivo De Janeiro translates as disabscondedness. That sense of truth is marked by the difference between a made totality and a whole of beings, which can ring through appearance, yet itself not appear. The harmony is disabsconded precisely in its non-appearance, between the notes, gathering the togetherness of the song in its cosmic harmonia. That's another Heideggerian word, harmonia. It is the gathering that the being of beings can be heard, provided we let ourselves be gathering into the gathering itself by listening to the harmony of the whole, can atone the world as the present situation. Emily Dickinson exemplifies in this poem, and this is her poem. By homely gifts and hindered words, the human heart is told nothing is the force that renovates the world. Yet here is the difficulty in. I'll read that again. By homely gifts and hindered words, the human heart is told nothing is the force that renovates the world. Yet here is the difficulty in. The renovation banks on being able to hear the logos in an age where its truth cannot reveal the concealment as such. It's precisely this sense of the nothing which becomes flagrant through its non-appearing gathering logos, which the psychotechnology circling, I will show, to be a response to the loss of in the culture, and a new beginning via logos as discourse. So basically what I'm trying to get at there is you know, this is really complicated. On one level it's really simple, but it's very difficult to bring into words. But the original sense of truth, right, the primordial sense of truth, aletheia, really is not correctness, which correctness banks on object, idea, correlate, and we call that truth, right, correspondence. The Greek original sense of the truth was that no, that all the good stuff was in the nothing per se. It was in concealment. And so aletheia, to the degree that truth, whatever's true, is the event of its being revealed, right? So for example, in the modern sense of truth, if something it shows up false, we call it incorrect. Like, and that's that's banking on basically an idea of that, that the nothing is nothing, it's nil. Whereas the further back in history you go, right, especially in Greece, they would call something that wasn't, that was false, being pseudo. The word pseudo, right, meaning the truth of it is lacking in appearance, right? It's lacking in disclosure, but you can still see that there's this presence of a kind of a pregnant sense of nothing, right? So nothing isn't a nihilism, right? It's a fullness. It's part of being, right? Okay. So how long have we been going here? I'll go for a little bit longer here. A few more paragraphs. Okay, the next section: metaphysics and the loss of logos. An in-depth study of Heidegger's, quote, history of metaphysics, unquote, is far outside the scope of this chapter, and is much still debated among scholars, which I am definitely not a scholar, over what Heidegger meant by history. However, my understanding of Heidegger's thinking of history provides a profound way of understanding the time and context that circling emerged out of and is a direct response to. It also serves as a pointer back to the beginning of philosophy and the ancient Socratic practice of dialogos, which this book is about, bringing it back into the modern context. For Heidegger, what he calls the history of metaphysics starts with Heraclitus and the pre-Socratic philosophers as the, quote, first beginning and inception of philosophical thinking, and was the first time that the being of beings was thought. In other words, until the pre-Socratics, thinking had not conceived of being as a whole by virtue of which gave beings their grounded being. This could only have happened by virtue of thought, of thinking. In other words, with the pre-Socratics, the most abstract concept, the category of categories, and the context of context was able to come into view. The onset of thinking being made it possible for man to partake in an understanding that for the first time afforded him to take a stand in relation to the world of beings. Thinking and language no longer just gave man holding and shelter in a mythopoetic world, but for the first time, thinking gave him the power to take up the world as such. With this ontological Big Bang was the inception of an intelligibility that we all stand on today, making everything we call modern and, in quote, self-evident. In the beginning, as exemplified in Heraclitus, thinking and being were unified and they were thought together with logos. However, as time went on, thinking and being became more and more distinct from each other. As this separation increased, it gave us a greater power over the world. However, also alienated us from the world. This combination of external increasing power and inner alienation exemplified thinking's unity with being as a parasitic processing. where the increased alienation led to the hunger for more power and control, leading to more alienation. This self-making estrangement has taken on a life of its own, culminating in a pernicious taking over of techne as the dominant mode of revealing the world. The being of beings is understood as the being of beings today is understood as a standing reserve, as our own resource to be optimized through increasing instrumentalization in a way that organizes almost everything we do and are. With every change in ontological understanding, so too the world itself changed in every way. As Heidegger saw it, this understanding of being went through 5 major epochs. The first onset came with the pre-Socratics, in which being was understood as phusis, out of a sense of astonishment, or a mood of astonishment, in that there is being. The second epoch came with the Platonic philosophers, in which being was understood as ousia, revealing the what being is, as the good, and is where knowledge became a way of revealing. The third epoch came with Christianity, in which being became understood as monotheistic creator God, and beings as the created. The fourth major epoch of modernity started with Descartes, in which being was understood as subjects standing over and against objects. And then with Nietzsche came the onset of postmodernism, in which being was understood as the meaningless upsurging of the will to power and the eternal return of the same through repetitive technical calculation, understood by Heidegger as standing reserve. The very thinking that revealed the primordial unity of thinking and being was the same openness that made it possible to close in forgetfulness of this wholeness and unity with being. This forgetful estrangement of man from being became first articulated by Descartes and the onset of modernity. And I'm going to quote Johannes's teacher, Ivo Gianarzo, I think is his last name. I'm going to quote him. It says, "The constellation changes radically when the revealed truth, Christianity, ceases to hold sway as a world-shaping power. This novelty, in fact, marks the onset of the modern age, or the new times. In the beginning of the modern age, or more modernly, man himself, in the newly found freedom of his powers, is required to step in order to fill the resulting gap with his thinking, and thus establishing self as a new ground for the being as such and in whole. Henceforth, man's thinking, and not, in fact, aletheia born in the consonant thinking, is the element in which the ground of being is constituted." So basically, he's, in quoting him, he's basically saying it's like the Christianity was an interesting period, right? Because with the onset of the Greeks, you have this really radically different. I mean, it's hard to describe how huge this was. This sense of being able to, in some sense, grab hold of being as such, right, was the made way for an understanding. For the first time, we have human beings were able to have an understanding such that that understanding upon which revealed the world differently based on how you understood it, right? That's a huge thing. And that came out of more of mythopoetic thinking, which is more of man's speech and language and thought was more in terms of finding shelter in beings, right? Like finding shelter in the mythopoetic world. So when when Christianity took hold, right, it's a really interesting thing because it's where these two come together in some sense, right? There's this revealed the revealed truth of Christianity, right, of the creator God, right, and the rationality, right, of this more explicit kind of thinking. However, rationality was used to disclose the truth already laid out by God, right? So you have a lot of those, the way those philosophical doctrines of the Middle Ages are these kind of rational proofs for what God said, right? And so the measure of how you knew it was rational, how it was true, is to the degree that you could explain and reveal what was already known, right? In a certain sense. And that's, so man was the creature of God and rationality was in service of that, right? So it was this kind of interesting thing that lasted, for a long time. And so Descartes comes in and and in some sense, he actually deeply fulfilled Christianity, right? Because Christianity had this really will to truth. It wanted to reveal the truth of the revelation of God, right? And in some sense, eventually, as I think Nietzsche, pointed out, that this will to truth eventually had God as the creator, as being essentially, to be questioned, right? And when that happened, right, was this point where was the point of the modern era, right, of subjects standing over against the objects, and then basically man, in some sense, man's thinking became the measure, right, through doubt of the truth of being. Okay, I'm gonna do a couple more paragraphs, and then I think I'll pick this up another time. It goes on, with modernity, the separation of thinking and being, fully explicit in Descartes' world, shaping, actually, I think I'm just going to stop there. With modernity, the separation of thinking and being became fully explicit in Descartes' world-shaping tweet. I think, therefore I am. However, in such a way that thinking has the power of determining the truth of being. Being is now contingent on man's thinking to represent being's grounding in being. In other words, beings now need to be grounded in our ability to represent them as being, i.e. our thinking. No longer was the world laid out as constituted by the non-contingent revealed truth of a God, and man his rational creature, whose rational powers were given to reveal the truth of his creator. Now Descartes was to carry out Christianity's will to truth, reaching its inevitable destiny to question the divine source of this truth, and the modern individual and eventually led to the question of God, God's word itself. I'm sorry, like this, I need to rework this paragraph. It eventually led to the questioning of God, God's words itself as subject over against objects, exemplified itself in full articulation as the Industrial Revolution that swept over the entire globe. With being now as inert extension of his subjectivity, every part of life rapidly took on the character of machination. Everything in the world everything in the world was now up for grabs as an object for a free-willing measuring subject. To be clear, by the history of the understanding of being, Heidegger didn't mean a mental or conscious cognitive activity, but rather history as the how being unfolds as temporality, specifically in the West. By understanding, he meant what we dwell in, organizing our very sense of the world. An epoch's understanding of being is what they already always find themselves being in, as the way the world simply discloses itself. The understanding of being is the way the world already always shows up as given in the prehension we find ourselves in the midst of already coping with. In other words, our understanding of being is the background that withdraws in the very way we inhabit our body, our gestures, how we see, sense, and respond to the world prior to conscious reflection. It's the basis upon which we build our architecture, organize our social roles, and our whole style of dwelling in our lived practices of thinking, speaking, and communicating, and communing. It is the basis upon which we conceive and construct our world, and those constructions hold and in turn construct us. Our understanding of being, in other words, is precisely what we do not see and conceive, but rather see with. In this sense, our understanding of being is that which is most concealed in its nearness, and thus is constitutionally the farthest away, and thus the most determinate. The current postmodern epoch we are living, which we are living, the age of technology, which is where being is no longer primarily intelligible as subjects and objects, but rather as what Heidegger calls the standing reserve, as revealed through Gestell, which is often translated as a framing. This shift from the modern to the postmodern is the transformation from man as subject overcoming object via mechanician or will to power into the total takeover of subjectivism as standing reserve via techne or will to will. So will to power, like what Nietzsche talks about, transforms into will to will. This understanding of being, in this understanding of being, all beings are intelligible by virtue of being disclosed as a standing reserve and the contingent means for production, use, and optimization. The important thing to understand with Gestell is its totalizing leveling of literally everything, including the human being as standing reserve. So that's the thing about Gestell, right? So, okay, your understanding of being, I mean, if you think about it, it's like it's the understanding upon which, the background understanding upon which everything is intelligible in the way that it's intelligible, right? Therefore, if you change that background understanding, of course, it's going to change everything else, how things show up, how, like in how they show up and what they are, right? And so Gestalt is things are no longer subjects and objects, but now in Gestalt, things are standing reserve, including the human being. So everything is, you know, and I'll go on to articulate this. By techne, Heidegger was not referring to technological objects, but rather techne as the dominant mode of revealing the world. In other words, with techne, everything shows up as a resource to be optimized for further technological advancement for the sake of greater technological advancement. Have you ever wondered why they keep making faster phones? Like they're faster than the speed of light or something now? That's kind of that sensibility. Being is no longer understood as the contingent one atoning all, as a constituting wholeness, but instead as a mere totality of stuff to be ordered into units of calculable order. Thus, beings are now prehended, not as objects with an essence, but as quantified data on call for exploitation through instrumental reason. The key point here is that everything is revealed as standing reserve and quantified totality, including the human being. Both the highest view, theo, and the innermost view, ontotheology, basically, reveals the world as a calculatable resource for its unquestioned advancement. Originally, in ancient Greeks, techne named the human activity of making. The activity of techne was seen as bringing a being's telos, or end, forth into appearance. Aristotle conceived that both natural beings and man-made beings had telos. The telos of natural beings would unfold naturally if unobstructed. For example, a seed's telos is a full-grown tree, and if the natural conditions were right, the seed would fully unfold as a tree into appearance. The telos of man-made things, on the other hand, would unfold through the maker's technical mastery. Just as a tree's telos was present but concealed as a seed from its origins, so too the telos of man-made objects was present but concealed as idea, and techne was the means by which the maker unfolded its being into full appearance, brought it about. Every part of the technical procedure of making was conceived as a gathering its being from out of concealment into aletheia, or truth, the light of appearance. The being of the object was accomplished through the means of technical mastery of the maker. The Greek understanding of being as the non-contingent source or principle of the idea of the good afforded and sustained techne to be the means to gather being into its light of appearance, i.e., being made. In a real sense, the meaning and intelligibility was already always intrinsically implicit, and techne was its accomplishing into the truth of its appearance. Every movement of techne was sustained by a meaningfulness that was in a real sense already there, and thus nurtured into its truth and sustaining light of appearance. However, techne becomes something drastically different in the postmodern epochal understanding of being in Gestalt. As stated earlier, in ancient Greece, techne was a human activity and a means of nurturing forth the telos of non-contingent being. Techne in the postmodern epoch is not a human activity, but rather the ontological determination demanding forth of beings as such. In other words, techne as a mode of revealing is the means by which the totality of beings is revealed as a standing reserve. The standing reserve, in turn, is the means for techne's advancement, which advances by means of revealing more standing reserve, and so on in an exponential quickening of the will to will to will. The will to will in the full realization and coming together of the will to power as that which is the eternal return of the same. Because the technological understanding of the being of beings is no longer understood as the principle of principles, discontingent source of intelligibility, disclosing the world as meaningful presence, but instead, in this epoch, the being of the world is as being's complete withdrawal from sense, and thus the world is challenged forth as quantified, calculated contingency. What is uncanny and striking about techne as the only mode of revealing is it cannot reveal itself as a mode of revealing. As Heidegger states, techne itself is nothing technological. In other words, Gestalt as the essence of modern technology is a mode of existence that is blind to the primordial sense of phusis, or thatness, and threatens to be the final mode of historical self-concealment of being as such. Heidegger states, Gestalt, this is a quote from him, quote, Gestalt conceals that revealing which in the sense of poiesis lets what presences come forth into appearance. I'll read that again. Gestalt conceals that revealing which in the sense of poiesis lets what presences come forth into appearance. Where the danger, so too the saving power, wrote Heiderlin. I propose the saving grace in our technological age is precisely in its totalizing blindness. The technological enframing cannot let, quote, what presences to come forth into appearance, unquote. And that which presences appears as the very meaning of human life, and thus Gestalt implicitly enacts a nihilism hidden underneath the mania of our technological advancements. Another way of saying this is being and meaning cannot be measured, quantifiable, or optimized. Being is not a being, and thus cannot be gathered as a resource of calculation. In other words, Gestalt cannot respond to nor hear the call of being, or even hear being in the depth of its total withdrawal. Human beings, however, dwell in meaning and is indwelled by meaning as the very care which discloses and beholds the world. Without a connection to what lets presences beat one's heart, the suffering of human life is sure to become unbearable. The saving power dwells within the violence that the insidious nihilism of our enframing epoch has on our soul. The saving power is disclosed precisely in that we suffer in response to the totalizing takeover of Gestel. That is, I propose, the small but real presence of the saving power as well as the greatest danger. The fact that the human being suffers in a world without meaning is itself meaningful, and perhaps the last possible site where being can still be heard in its place of hiddenness. An ontologically attuned listening to the primordial call of being in the postmodern epoch is attuning precisely to being's withdrawal. More precisely, it is hearing the suffering of our souls resulting from the hidden nihilism under the technological progress of our time. Perhaps listening to this suffering is where the long-concealed logos dwells, and whose listening gathers within the gathering itself, and perhaps an originary way of revealing can come to sense from out of its own concealment is a gathering astonishment in remembering that this is. It is with this attuned listening that we now look into one of the forms of suffering this ontological withdrawal has taken, specifically in examining the nature of sociality and social discourse as it's being restructured and transformed by technology. This will set up the context in which to look at circling as a revealing response to the enframing of sociality in the postmodern epoch. Okay, here's the next section. The world is social. In summary, so far, the first section we considered the role of the logos plays in revealing the world and human life as implicitly meaningful. Through examining some of the fragments of Heraclitus, we saw that it was through the logos that the non-appearing wholeness of being is heard as the atoning harmony of beings. This allowed us to consider that the nihilism of our epoch could be seen as a kind of deafening to logos, and thus revealing the possibility of learning to listen to the logos is a possible response to nihilism. In the second section, we looked at examining how we got here by examining Heidegger's account of the history of metaphysics as being the path of the forgetfulness and abandonment of the being of beings, starting with the pre-Socratics and culminating as our current epoch of the age of technology. We ended that section showing that the saving power and grace may dwell in and through the suffering brought about from the loss of meaning is something that could not be reached by techne, and thus could be a small opening to a new way of revealing. In this section, I will attempt to show the way the standing reserve is literally taking over social discourse via the internet and literally transforming the structure of human relationships, leading to a growing and chronic sense of loneliness, alienation, and pain in correlation with it. I'll flesh this out first by showing how the meaning of the world unfolds and manifests as the being with others in primordial care. Once we see that it's the world itself that is at stake in our social relations, it will give us the background to see how circling as a direct response to the problem and opening to the beginning of perhaps the freedom from it. This will open the way for the final section on circling and dialectic. We have touched on in the previous section how an epoch's understanding of being is what governs the meaningful disclosure of the world at every level. As an epoch's core logoi of intelligibility unfolds and changes in the form of its culture's unfolding, it does so in and through social discourse. Discourse, okay, this is really important, okay. Discourse is the way the logos gathers an epoch's understanding of being and substantiates, maintains, and distributes it as the meaningful structure of the world as such. The connection between discourse and the world is ontological and thus co-determines and disclose each other as the worlding of the world. In other words, analogically speaking, the world is the conversation we live in, and how we live in it is in the form of the conversation we are having about it. Rilke beautifully exemplifies our paradoxical relation to the world poetically thus. Here's the poem. World was in the face of the beloved, but suddenly it poured out and was gone. World is outside. World cannot be grasped. Why didn't I, from the full beloved, why didn't I, from the full beloved face, as I raise it to my lips, why didn't I drink world so near I couldn't almost taste it? Ah, I drank. Insatiably I drank. But I was filled up also with too much world, and drinking, I myself ran over. Given the world is the world by virtue of it being the horizon of intelligibility in which interworldly beings meaningfully come to appearance, I turn to the social sciences for further understanding of how this meaning comes to be through language and social discourse. Captain, we have a problem. Social sciences implicitly sees sociology, its object of study, as a region or category of the world. Operating out of a Cartesian metaphysics, social science by default starts from the assumption that a human subject becomes social as a result of its social activity with other subjects, accounting for and giving rise to the social world it studies. However, this begs the question as to how a human subject becomes social in the first place without already knowing how to perform the social activity by which it becomes social. And the same goes for the world. How does the world become social through this activity without the world already being the condition of possibility for that social activity to appear in the first place, let alone itself being at stake in those encounters? This unsolvable paradox arises out of a classical Cartesian category mistake, which attempts to explain and secure something ontological with the epistemological. Philosophical thinking since Descartes, in a very real sense, has been an attempt to resolve the tensions of Descartes' thinking However, from within the same metaphysical onto-theological basis, which, in the end, advanced the very tensions in the attempt to resolve them. To bring to light the ontological connection between sociality and the world, I will need to think outside of and beyond modernity. Taking the lead from history in loosening the Cartesian grip, I call on the thinking of Martin Heidegger, specifically his thinking from being in time, which quite literally transformed all philosophical thinking since it was published. Martin Heidegger's groundbreaking philosophical work, published in 1927, Being in Time, pierced through modernity's Cartesian dualism and disclosed man not as a subject, but as Dasein. Literally translates to being there. In other words, with Heidegger's groundbreaking hermeneutic phenomenological way of thinking, the modernist spell broke of conceiving individuals as encapsulated thinking subjects alongside the world as its object. Instead, with an astonishing depth of thinking the world had not seen since Socrates, Heidegger's thinking showed that the being of human being was already always a being in the world. World discloses as man's concealment, and in turn, man unconceals as world's withdrawal. As Alan Watts poetically said, we do not come into this world, we come out of it, as leaves from a tree. As the ocean waves, the universe peoples. Adding to Watts' poems, as the universe peoples, people, world. Us peoples, world, ontologically as Dasein, in the mode of care, translated from the German Sorge. From this deeper ontological perspective, it is in and through primordial care that the world addresses us as situation. And it is also in and through care that the Logos gathers us as radically open to this address. Bringing this all together, to be the being in the world we are is to already always find ourselves in a situation towards which we are concernfully responding. This ontological primordial care is the condition of possibility for the Logos to gather the moreness of inexhaustible intelligibility as our beholden of what is of ultimate concern. That's from Tillich, ultimate concern. Understanding the human being and the world as ontologically belonging together through Dasein, being in the world sets the stage for a way of understanding sociality from within the ontological wholeness and already always belonging to Dasein as being in the world and not a separate region or result of Dasein's structure. And I quote Heidegger here. Heidegger names this Mitsein as being with others, and I quote him here. As being in the world, Dasein is at the same time being with each other. The aim here is to assert that mostly we do not exist as single persons, that others are also present. Rather, being with each other, or Mitsein, implies an ontological characteristic of Dasein that is equipment primordial with being in the world. This aspect of Dasein persists even if no one else is actually spoken to or perceived. So in other words, Meitesen, being, translates like the way that we're being in the world is that we're already always being with others, even when we're alone, right? So in other words, our being is a being with. In other words, we're not sole proprietorships standing on a world. We're already in the world, in a social context, and the world shows up in terms of that context, right? Meitesen, being with others. Meitsen names how, insofar as I am being in the world, I am being in as being with others. Therefore, we do not become a social being through being in the world socially with other people. Instead, sociality is an ontological dimension of being as such. Say that again. Instead, sociality is an ontological dimension of being as such. And this social dimension of being shows itself in how the world enables our social relations. Nicole Krensberg Knudsen, in the abstract of his paper on Heidegger and the problem of others, states, and I quote him, by arguing that the world not only makes the appearance of others possible, but also that the world is itself at stake in these encounters, unquote. I open this section proposing that the historical epoch's understanding of being unfolds and maintains as the intelligibility of the world in and through social discourse. By using Heidegger's thinking from being and time, I attempted to break free of a Cartesian dualism to show that man and the world as a ontological wholeness, and that sociality was a dimension of this ontological wholeness that being refers to as Heidegger refers to as Meitsen, as being with others. With this understanding, we can begin to appreciate that social discourse does not primarily result in a social world, quote unquote, but much more profoundly reveals the sociality of the world itself in the social relations it enables. With this much more profound understanding that the world as such is at stake in and through discourse as an ontological dimension of the world, I will next look at the internet's impact on the structures of social discourse in the light of our current postmodern epoch. Through looking at the takeover of the standing reserve, I will attempt to show how the internet is transforming the meaning of human relationships and the possibility this opens up in our response to nihilism. Okay, it's the last section, and it's called, right now, I'm calling it From Seeing Others to Enframing Others. In a matter of less than 20 years, the technological advancement of the internet has literally connected the entire globe with each other by eliminating, in a certain sense, time and space at the level of communication between one another. As I write, technology has already expanded this to the object level with 3D printing. And advances have been made in the ability to make the molecular substances to print these objects. As Standing Reserve takes the practices of social discourse in our social relations, come to be seen as a cybernetic system of inputs and outputs and exchange of information along a circuit. As this happens, people are seen as a node of one's network. The value of the node is derived from how they are seen by other nodes in the network. The person as a node, standing in reserve as a resource available as part of the network. The more connections you have, the more valuable you are as a resource of the network. Communication is reduced to transactional information exchange within the network. The better the network, the more efficient the transactions between its connections. The more inputs a node has, the more valuable and powerful that node's output. In other words, people are progressively seen as a means to an end versus as an end in themselves of ultimate value. As Martin Buber states, I vow, as an end in themselves. Social media companies frame each user as a quantifiable data collected by predictive algorithms, captured and gathered into standing reserve to be exploited for data in service of greater predictors for greater capture. As the algorithms track the object of your attention, so it can predict and feed your attention with those objects more optimized for your attention to capture it and be captured by it. This in turn is measured, calculated, and refined over and over again into tighter reciprocal feedback loops that loop in all of your contacts, your friends, your credit cards, your purchase, your travel, and even your pulse. As the distance between attention and optimized object collapses, so does the difference between attention and its object as such. The collapse of distance between attention and technology can be seen in how the internet has become the medium of and the structural economy of exchange on virtually every level of human existence, both personally and societally. In other words, the means of attention itself has become in many ways fashioned, shaped, and structured by and in terms of technology. Through our phones, calendars, reminders, etc., that in turn have structured the way that we think and conceive our world in every way, in a way that's virtually, no pun intended, invisible to us. Before the internet's form of texting, messaging, posting, emailing, etc., the most basic mutual two-way exchange of information between two or more individuals always had to take place interpersonally through embodied social discourse and synchronistic communication. In other words, before the internet, if you needed to exchange the most basic information, you had to do it in person or at least over the telephone. In other words, communication required communing. The internet made it possible to exchange information uncoupled from live in-person speech. In other words, it became possible to connect without having to relate. This is no small change, especially when one considers that human beings become who they are in and through these very living relations, which last through one's entire lifetime. A child develops in and through the living relations with the parent and immediate family. These relations mature them to be capable of expanding into the relations with their peers and teachers in school, through which the child matures and transforms into a responsible adult. This change is a transformation predicated on the individual no longer being dependent on the previous relationships, and by virtue of it comes into greater relationship with society. This greater relationship with society in turn becomes the next relational context which a person develops and transforms through. Okay, so this, I haven't quite worked the word. This is going to be a little bit jumpy here because I'm just trying to rework this. So I don't know if this will make sense. This next paragraph. So how exactly do human beings paradoxically become differentiated individuals through relationship with others? Human relationship is the place where the two most basic existential drives a human being has is brought forward into living tension. In other words, to be a human being is to deeply desire and be driven for the security that comes from a sense of belonging, a belonging to tribe, and to community. At the same time, and on the other hand, is the existential drive to stand out as a unique individual, glowing in cosmic significance. It is in and through our interpersonal face-to-face relationships throughout our entire lifetime that embody both the challenges and possibilities for these drives to be fulfilled or stunted. In-person, face-to-face relations call on these deepest capacities of body, mind, and awareness into exercise. So in other words, what I'm trying to get at is this sense of like it's in dialogue, right? It's in the most basic conversation where I'm on one line, I'm called into we, right? I'm called into belonging and inhabiting and belonging with you. But to the degree that I can belong truthfully, right, and contribute to that belonging, right, it's to the degree that I can also be an individual that stands out in that contribution, right? And so ideally, right, human maturity, it's always about this sense of relationship that feeds back and I'm fed back into in such a way that my contributions reveal my individuality, that reveal what I'm contributing to, that disclose myself as an individual, that discloses the community. And if this autopoetic sense works out, you end up becoming a pretty cool person, right? So, but like that's at every level, like in every, but in where that culminates, you can almost say the literal and the symbolic culmination or theater of that enactment of those two existential drives is relationship, is human relationship, living relationship. So basically what I'm getting at is like, what happens, right, where technology all of a sudden introduces this division, right, where I have all these ways and we're going more and more this direction where all of a sudden the structure of reality, even if this just happened a little bit, right, you could just imagine this, like where all of a sudden, where it's not happening just a little bit, it's happening a lot, where the structure of reality all of a sudden no longer requires these relations, or at least makes them optional. And by the way, those, I don't know if you've noticed, but those relationships are a pain in the ass, right? So there's nothing comfortable about them. In fact, real ones are really uncomfortable a lot of times. That's what makes them real. So, but now that we have an option, it's built into the structure of reality in a way that it wasn't before. What's the impact of that? And that's what I'm kind of going into. And so I'll go into that more, and then I'm going to go into laying out circling and how what circling is, which is the practice of in relationship being with what is, and start to distinguish this as a response to nihilism, but also leading into dialectic, philosophical dialectic, into the ground of being able to directly deal with the structure of reality in discourse, right? What that means and how circling's revealing this. And so thank you for hanging in there. If you hung in there this long, I've really appreciated the opportunity just to walk through this. I think when I come back to this and start writing again, I'm going to do so with much more of a grip on what I'm saying or what wants to be said. Thank you.